Ladies and gentlemen, I was inspired to share my story after receiving a divorce notice. I made a simple suggestion that led to my husband divorcing me. I didn't end up doing what I was thinking, but I had to pay for it. I should have given it more thought before telling him. Now I'm being served divorce papers. I never thought that suggesting to open our marriage would not sit well with my husband. I thought he also had the same idea, but I never knew we were far apart. My name is Jessica. I am a 26-year-old fashion designer. My husband's name is Fred. He is a 29-year-old. My husband and I have been together for 3 years now. We met at a family function that my mother hosted. I was invited to attend because I designed most of the dresses worn by the ladies. I loved my work, and my mother was very proud of me. I didn't exactly like going to those kinds of parties because my mother was always trying to match me with somebody. On that day, I met my husband and Fred. I was talking to my mother, and like every other day, I didn't even look his way. I quickly spoke to my mother and left before she could introduce us. I was in a hurry to leave. At some point during the event, I ran into Gabrielle. She was such a lovely woman. I met her through my mother, and I had made some dresses for her. She was always very kind to me and supportive of my work. I respected Gabrielle a lot, and that's why I followed her when she pulled me back into. At the event, she kept on talking about how her grandson is sweet. At some point, I had to tune her out. I thought it was time for me to leave when she pulled me across the hall to where my mother was standing, talking to a man. Gabrielle introduced him as her grandson Fred. At that moment, I was really interested because Fred is a very handsome man. Fred and I got talking and he told me about what he did for a living, and he was really complimentary about my work, which I was grateful for. Fred and I exchanged numbers, and from there we started speaking. At that point, I was interested in seeing where things would go. I was looking for something more serious because I had just ended a relationship that wasn't going well. Fred told me he was different from other guys, and I believed him. He took me out on dates, which I really enjoyed. He was very attentive, and I liked that everything was going smoothly. At some point, Fred asked me to be his girlfriend, and I accepted. I said I'd be his girlfriend, and I did. I was a bit unsure at first though, because I really loved Fred and I knew he loved me too. While we were dating, I found out that Fred had lost his mother when he was very young and was brought up by his grandmother. I got to meet his whole family, and his grandmother, who he adored, was his everything, and she was fine with us being together. A few months later, Fred and I got married in a lovely ceremony. I could say that I was totally in love, and we bought a house together and moved in together. Our marriage was great, and we were the ideal couple. We went on regular dates, went on vacation, and attended lots of functions and parties together. Our lives were going really well, and felt surreal. Of course, we had different arguments from time to time, but we always found our way back to each other. We didn't really stay mad at each other for long and had our ways of settling each argument. A year into our marriage, things began to change. I started traveling a lot for work, and Fred was promoted, so he was often away. It felt like everything was going against us. Whenever I had time to spare before a trip, I tried to make the most of it. Fred could be in another state, but we made sure to find time, even if it was just an hour. At one point, we didn't see each other for over 6 months. Sure, we talked on the phone and made video calls, but it was different. I was busy creating my designs one day, when Gabrielle came into my office like she did every other day. I thought it was going to be a very good afternoon talking about random things, but it wasn't. It felt like everything started from there. She scolded me about not being present in my marriage and how I was neglecting my house. I told her I wasn't neglecting my duties as a wife, and that Fred has been busy with work. She said Fred had complained to her that I'm no longer available at home and that work has taken most of my time. I was shocked to hear that because it was Fred. I hadn't seen her in a couple of weeks. We'd gone 6 months without seeing each other, but after that I decided it was not going to happen again. I hired more people to work for me, so I could spend more time with my husband. When Gabrielle was talking to me about what Fred said, I was disappointed, so I told Gabrielle what was going on. But she didn't want to see things from my perspective. I understood how much she meant to Fred, so I let her talk about what she didn't understand. When Gabrielle left, I was angry. I felt like if Fred and I had issues, he should talk to me first, not his grandmother. After a few days, Fred returned from his trip, and I decided to talk to him about his grandmother's visit. He apologized. He said he didn't know what to do. We hadn't seen each other for 6 months and he needed to speak to someone. I understood what he meant. We decided to resolve our issues and cut back the hours we were working so we could have enough time for each other. Fred began to work less and I also did the same. We started coming back home to each other early. I started cooking dinners for us. We hung out with friends and it was as if we were dating again. Over the next couple of months, we celebrated Fred's birthday in style. I trusted Gabrielle. To take things to the next level, we also invited friends and colleagues. It was a beautiful celebration. A year later, we were back to where we started. We were working more and saw each other less often, only meeting during Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners. I felt like we were drifting apart, and hardly saw Fred, which I was unhappy about. At some point, I even started wondering if he was seeing someone else. I didn't want to think about it too much, and decided to take my mind off things by getting busy with work. When my mother came to visit, she complained about I had to tell her I'd been busy, and that I'd been seeing Fred. She asked about him, and I told her what I knew. My mom was a typical housewife who didn't understand why a woman needed to work if her husband was providing for her. That's why she was always in charge of putting together events for my dad when he was alive. She was doing that today, but I didn't want to be a housewife who was just responsible for taking care of events. I wanted to make a name for myself. I knew she wouldn't understand, so I let it go, along with my love for Fred. With Fred at that moment, she played a part in my marrying Fred. She kept going on and on about how I was too successful and I should be grateful. I saw a man who was willing to marry me. I knew she meant well, but that wasn't me. I had always wanted to work for my own money. My mother left my store and I got a call from Gabrielle. She said she wanted to see me and Fred in 2 days and it was urgent. I didn't know what was going on, so I said I should call Fred. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew he'd been avoiding my calls, but I thought I'd caught him. I gave him a heads up about what his grandmother had said. I wondered what she could possibly have to tell us. I hoped she wasn't sick because she meant a lot to Fred, and that could break him. I didn't know what to do when it was time to go see Gabrielle because I still haven't managed to get hold of Fred. I thought I'd go and explain things to her, but when I got there, I saw Fred chatting away with his grandmother. I was pretty shocked. Fred came back and didn't think to return my calls or even come back home. To make matters worse, he was acting like we weren't having any issues in front of his grandmother that threw me off balance. He was portraying a happy family in front of his grandmother, and we hadn't seen each other for weeks. I decided to have a chat with him when we were left alone. He told me that he didn't want to disappoint his grandmother. I asked him why he ignored my calls and didn't answer me. I felt like Fred had changed. He wasn't the person I married. I knew we'd been busy, but that can't be the reason for the rift between us. Gabrielle returned and sat down. We started chatting right away. I asked if she was sick, but she said she wasn't. She said she'd called because Fred and I had been married for 3 years now without kids. I was surprised. I looked at Fred, but he seemed indifferent. Before I could understand what was going on, Gabrielle started crying. She said she was getting old and needed to see her grandchildren before she died. I was about to tell her that it wasn't possible right now when Fred interrupted me. He said we could give her what she wants right then. I felt like crying because my husband wasn't. I was listening to him and it seemed like he was promising Gabriel something we should have discussed as a couple, rather than him making the decision on his own. I looked at Gabrielle and she seemed really happy. I wanted to speak with Fred, but he left saying he needed to attend to something a few hours later. I left Gabrielle's house on my way home and thought about everything. I was feeling pretty sad. When I got home, I saw that Fred was there. I decided to confront him about it. I tried to explain to him that we barely had time for ourselves and that a child could complicate things. I told him that we should really explain things to Gabrielle, but he was adamant that he would make his grandmother happy, regardless of my opinion. It seemed like Fred wasn't listening to me at that moment. He was more focused on how to grant his grandmother's wishes. I also wanted to make her happy. I'm not against having a child at all. I just didn't want my child to lack attention from us, and I didn't want my child to be left in the hands of a nanny. The fact that Fred didn't understand me at that moment made me very upset, and we ended up in a heated argument. He didn't see things from my own perspective, and I think I also didn't understand where he was coming from. Of course, every couple would we wanted to have a child, but we barely had time for each other. Bringing a child into that situation would have been a bad idea. I wasn't ready to quit my job, and Fred wasn't ready either. I don't have a problem working, but I have a problem staying at home doing nothing. I didn't want to be a full-time housewife, watching TV and doing house chores. I'm not trying to condemn those who are full-time housewives. I think it's fair to say that being a full-time housewife isn't necessarily a bad thing. I love my career, and I like putting a smile on my clients' faces. I also wanted to put a smile on Gabriella and my family, but it seemed like I wasn't doing enough because I literally did try to make them happy, especially Gabriella. Weeks went by and Gabriella constantly reminded us about wanting to see her grandchildren, so one day I called my husband and told him that we really need to settle this issue of having a child. He wasn't as concerned as I'd been back then because everyone assumed I was the issue. In fact, we both were to blame, but he made it seem like I was the one at fault. So Fred and I spoke on the phone, and I asked him if he'd be home the following weekend so we could resolve things. He told me to give him about 30 minutes so that he could get back to me, and that he was in a meeting. I agreed, and we ended the call after speaking with my husband. I grabbed my bag and headed home. It was time for me to close for the day, so I went home and hoped that my husband would keep to his promise and return the call. When I arrived home, I found the house was empty as usual. I had my shower and changed into my pajamas. I was about to head to the kitchen to fix something for dinner when my husband called. He apologized for not keeping to the time. We chatted about our day, and I asked about the meeting he had that day. I was pleased to hear that everything went okay. On the bright side, I asked him if he could come back that weekend so we could talk things out, especially the child aspect. He said he would come. We talked a bit more on the phone before we ended the call. I had my dinner and watched my usual TV shows before I went to bed. The next day, I was up early and headed home. One of my good clients had booked to be styled for a photo shoot. So I left home before 5:00 a.m. I went to the client's house with my team and all the equipment we needed for the shoot. It was a birthday photo shoot, and we needed to be on top of our game. I met my old schoolmate Becca. I was a year older than Becca, and also a year ahead of her when we were in college. We had a mutual friendship and Becca seemed calm back then. I asked her what she was doing in the studio. She said she was helping her cousin's sister with a few things. She was in the studio and said the lady she was working with was her cousin's sister. She'd just come by with a few things. She also told me she had no idea I was the stylist who always styled her cousin. She complimented my fashion sense and said she hoped to be like me someday. I felt really happy and proud at that moment. I was proud of myself for being able to put this through all by myself. It was a proud moment for me, guys. Laugh out loud, Becca, and I chatted for a long time while I left my crew members to work. I usually left my clients with my crew members because I also wanted them to learn, so I gave them a chance to represent me, which they often did effectively. Becca and I talked a lot about school, businesses, and, on a personal note, I really enjoyed chatting with Becca. I was so engrossed in the conversation that I forgot what I came there to do at first. I also showed her the work I had done and a few other things. So, I had a nice time with Becca. 30 minutes later, we were all set to leave and said our goodbyes. Becca exchanged contacts and got in touch with each other. I and my colleagues went straight to the store and carried on with our usual routine. My husband called to say he'd be back the next day. I ended the call and carried on with what I was doing. So, I didn't go to work the next morning because it was Saturday. I don't usually work at weekends. I decided to limit my workload that day. My husband was expected to come back home, so I waited a few hours. Fred arrived home, and I welcomed him as usual. I wanted him to have a rest before telling him what I had in mind. He went and freshened up, and a few minutes later he came down to have lunch. I went to the sitting room to continue watching my movie. Fred later came. He came over to where I was seated, and asked me what was so important that I had to call him over to discuss. He said he was curious to know, and that he'd been paying attention to me. I didn't know how to put it to him, because I'd gotten so furious. I mustered the courage and told him we should open up our marriage since we barely see each other or spend time together. We could still be a couple, and our families wouldn't need to know about it. I also told him I wasn't ready to have a child just yet because we both don't have time, and I wasn't ready to be a full-time mom. I wanted to concentrate more on my career until I was ready. I said that Fred yelled at me and almost gave me a slap. He was shocked, and at the same time looked at me in disgust. I could see that he was really disappointed in me. Fred left my side and went inside the room in that state of anger. He broke a lot of valuables and even broke our wedding pictures. I tried to calm him down, but he didn't listen. I ran out of the house because I didn't want Fred to harm me. I told Fred about my suggestion, and he got really mad. I haven't seen Fred since. He's been angry ever since we were together. I think I might have woken up the beast in him. Hi guys, I've read all your comments, and I appreciate it. I've also seen the hateful comments, and I know I deserve all of that. Let me get straight to the point. I ran out of the house in fear because I'd never seen my husband that mad before. I went to my mom's house to explain what I had to tell her, that Fred and I weren't the couple we always seem to be at family gatherings. She kept reminding me of how she felt about my suggestion. The next day, I got a call from Gabriel. I already knew that my husband had told her. I couldn't pick up the phone because I was really embarrassed. I'd woken up with puffy eyes. Apparently I'd cried all night after thinking about what I'd suggested to my husband. I thought he wanted to open it up, since things weren't like before, so I didn't pick up the call or return it. It had been 10 hours since Eid left home and my husband didn't call me. He'd switched his lines so I couldn't reach him. Just as I was about to leave the bed, I got a knock on my door. I didn't answer, and after a while the person opened the door and came in. It was my mom. She sat down on the bed and told me Fred had sent something for me. I got up, hoping maybe he wanted to see me. I got curious as I couldn't believe it when I opened the package and found out that it was divorce papers. My mom gave me a hug and patted me to stop crying. The papers were already signed by Fred. I was left to sign it. My husband knew I would come see him after seeing the divorce papers, so he left town that very day. He instructed our family lawyer to come back. The next day I signed the papers. 2 days later Fred left town and I signed the divorce papers and handed them over to the lawyer. It was a tough decision, but I had to make it because there was nothing I could do to change his mind. I've been living separately from my husband for months now. I moved out of my mom's house and I'm managing. I didn't want to go back to my mom's and start staying there again. I wanted to be independent and have my own place. Fred moved on and he never spoke to me since the last time I ran out of the house. I've also moved on with my life. I want to try and put my life together and also try out new things. Most times I usually go to my store and get myself busy so as to make me forget all that. That's what's happened in the last few months. Gabrielle never called back. Ever since I ignored her call, I know I must have really hurt her, but I guess she doesn't want to see my face again. So, that's my story. I hope you've learned something from it. I hope none of you would make the same mistake I made. I should have never told my husband. I guess this was a lesson well learnt.